So, Dr. Roller, welcome back to the show. It's always an honor to have you.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be back today.
Excellent. Um, so, we're going to be looking at a very vibrant and ever changing time in the ancient Mediterranean world, the rise and fall of the Mithridatic dynasty of Pontus on the Black Sea. Located south of the Black Sea, its story is tied up in the tribulations and machinations of many historical changes in the ancient Mediterranean world. Its culture, a diverse mixture of Persian, Greek, and native elements. However, before we get into the dynasty itself, there's some groundwork we need to lay. If you could tell us about the early history of Pontus, what were the major cities? What was the function of the temple states? Also, how did its geography, wealth, and strategic location shape the early history?
Well, the word Pontus simply means sea, S-E-A, in Greek. And at a relatively early date, Greeks realized that they could leave the Mediterranean and there was this great sea, what we call the Black Sea, up to the northeast. And they could begin to explore it and find out all kinds of interesting things. And eventually, the name Pontus also came to be applied to the southern coastal regions of the sea that's in modern Turkey, an area of very complex mixed cultures because the Assyrians had been in that area early on. There were indigenous peoples in that area. Greeks had penetrated maybe about the 7th century BC or so. There was a flourishing culture of temple states where the priest of a temple state had essentially royal privileges and owned a great deal of land. So it was a very complex and diverse region from earliest times, long before the Greeks really knew very much about it. And so we have this duality where Pontus is both the name of a district on the south coast of the Black Sea, which is also called Pontus, and eventually the name Pontus applies territorially to the entire coast of the sea. It can be confusing sometimes to all of us.
Right. And what I found very interesting about this area is that very early on, the Greek imagination kind of latches on to
Mm-hmm.
this region. So, not
Mm-hmm.
only through exploration, but also through kind of myth and lore, things like that. Of course, you have the story of the Argonauts. That's where Jason and his companions are going to. They're going to get the Golden Fleece from, the kingdom of Colchis in the Black Sea. It's where Medea's from, right? Um, but you also have the story of the Amazons coming from this region. Xenophon goes through this area famously, and he Xenophon famously goes through this area. As he recounts famously in the Anabasis. So tell us about the early Greek exploration and interest in the region of Pontus for a bit.
Well, the story of Jason and the Argonauts, while it becomes one of the most intriguing and entertaining myths, as with all complex mythical stories, has some basis in the situation. And the Greeks probably learned relatively early on that there were riches to be had, especially in the southeastern Black Sea, Colchis, which was a region of gold production. To some extent, it still is. And long before the Trojan War, a generation or two before the Trojan War, they obviously sent expeditions to that area and began to learn about the southern coast of the Black Sea. It was the first major probing of Greek peoples outside the conventional part of the Mediterranean. But of course, as always, things get tangled with myth, and there are certain obvious formulas here. The barbarian princess who becomes a sorceress and really becomes exceedingly dangerous and the story, as you mentioned, of the Amazons, which may have some grounding in the warrior queens, the Scythian warrior queens living north of the Black Sea, but become a major feature of Greek history. Mythology is always a tangle, but nevertheless, the bottom line seems to be that at an early date, Greeks learned that the Black Sea was worth exploring, and they sent out expeditions and learned especially about the southern coast, that is, of the area that came to be called Pontus.
Yeah, what I found, I know David Brond has a book coming out soon about the Amazons that I'm looking forward to reading. What I found fascinating about this conception of Pontus in the Greek imagination is again this liminality. It's a space like kind of beyond. So they're as the regions become more explored and known, then they have to keep pushing the boundaries further and further. But
Well, the world is always different just beyond the limit of knowledge.
mhm.
We can see this with Atlantis, which originally was probably in the Aegean, then it shows up in the Western Mediterranean, then it shows up out in the Atlantic. As you say, the limits of knowledge move, the world that is different also moves. And it's the same thing with the Amazons. They tend to move just beyond where things are known. They can always come from the unknown, but the unknown always is changing.
Yeah, it's always a fascinating part of
Yeah.
storytelling and narrative. Um, so the Mithridatic kingdom itself, um, the founding is inextricably tied up with the aftermath of the death of Alexander the Great and the struggle between his generals. In other words, this is the dawning of the Hellenistic age. Um, we're talking about I believe it's 323 BCE when Alexander passes. So tell us about this period of time.
Well, the bottom line here is that Alexander died at a relatively young age, 323 BC, and had left, he was at Babylon, and he had left no provision for any kind of succession. And in fact, no provision for ruling the territories that he had conquered or anything like that. And so this quarrel broke out between his senior staff, basically, that kind of lasted for a whole generation with various changes in power and so on that people have written volumes about, and we won't really get into that. But one feature that happened was that people were able to carve out little territorial areas. We think of the great kingdoms that emerged, like the Ptolemies in Egypt or the Seleucids in Syria, but there were lots of little principalities. Somebody who may or may not have been associated with Alexander, or may have been associated with someone who was associated with Alexander, kind of goes to a remote area and carves out a little principality for himself. And we have to remember all of this territory was the Persian Empire, which is now defunct. Alexander has killed the last Persian king, and although he's legally and technically Persian king himself, there's no power structure. So one of these people who emerges kind of from nowhere is a person whom we call Mithridates I, and he's called in the sources the founder. And for various reasons, largely connected with his own survival, he goes up into Northwest Asia Minor, a fairly remote area, and seems to establish himself as a local dynast. Now, he couldn't do this if he didn't have resources. So he obviously has access to money and manpower and so forth. But this is the basic core of the Mithridatic kingdom, a relatively small and obscure principality in the north central part of Turkey, modern Turkey. And there's no reason to think he's going to get anywhere with any of this. Most of these little regional dynasts disappear or are absorbed by the major kingdoms. But what's unusual about Mithridates, the founder, is that he manages to create this kingdom and build on it. And eventually that lasts for hundreds of years as what we call the Kingdom of Pontus, because it's in this area of North Central Asia Minor that comes to be called Pontus.
Right. You were talking earlier about how these kingdoms were kind of carved up, these royal these this title of royalty proclaimed, just kind of, out of the blue. It's more proclamatory. It's more a proclamation at this point than actual reality in certain cases. So Mithridates, the founder, is, of course, his family's not connected to Alexander, but he was part of the entourage of, one of Alexander's most trusted, confidants, and of course his Antigonus, the one-eyed Ophthalmos, right?
Yes.
And his son Demetrius. Um, and of course, Plutarch tells that great story about how, and again, this gets to the importance of dreams in antiquity, right? How Antigonus has this dream, uh,
Yeah.
and like he starts suspecting Mithridates, so he's like, okay, we're gonna have to get rid of this guy, and you know, the whole point of the story is that Demetrius had a good character because he kind of like, he did what his dad told him to do, which is not to tell Mithridates, but he also kind of warned his friend, and that's why Mithridates fled and kind of created his own area. So,
It makes
very interesting.
it out of town very quickly.
Mm.
And we have to remember there is no legal process here for becoming king. I suppose if you're part of a dynasty and your ancestors are king, that's one thing, like Alexander. But even he had to be elected by the Macedonian assembly. But a king is an assertion of power. And basically, what Mithridates the First does in a few years is say, I've got territory, I've got money, I've got supporters, so I am a king. And it's as simple as that. And it's the same thing actually with people like Ptolemy the First. They go through the same kind of self assertion of kingship. So Mithridates, within a few years, is king of Pontus. And the only person at first who knows that he's king of Pontus is Mithridates himself. But in the long run, he makes it stick because he has the resources.
Yeah, he carved out that little area for himself, and his ancestry and the ancestry of the Mithridatic dynasty in general is very interesting because it's not Macedonian, it's not Greek or anything like that. It's actually from the Persian elite. So tell us about this for a bit.
Well, there's a kind of disenfranchised Persian elite lurking everywhere. As we know, Alexander legally and technically brought the Persian kingdom to an end by killing its last king, Darius III. And Alexander legally inherits the Persian kingdom, but still there are all the Persians who used to run the kingdom out there. And they, to some extent, even though there's a power vacuum, they are a force to be reckoned with. And one thing Alexander had done before he died was to try to integrate them. He had this mass wedding of himself and his staff members with noble Persian women. So Alexander's trying to integrate the Persian elite into his kingdom, but of course his kingdom is stillborn because he's dead very quickly. But still, the Persian elite is a power to be reckoned with, and because of intermarriage, especially, and with the Mithridatic descendants, there's a complex series of intermarriages. And we have to remember that in antiquity, marriage is political. It's not to improve your sex life, it's because it's important to make a political connection. And so to bring the Persian elite into the new power structure is exceedingly important. And that's one thing the Mithridatic kings are very good at. They bring Persians, they bring other Greeks, and create a new power structure of this mixed race dynasty.
Yeah, it's very things get complicated when we have some migrating Celts coming into northern Asia Minor. These are what came to be called the Galatians. Of course, the Galatians are most known from, of course, Paul's letter in the New Testament, but they're a European people who came to settle there later, and that they caused a lot of complications for Mithridates, the founder, and also his immediate successors, such as Ariobarzanes. Um, so tell us about this complicated relationships the
Yes,
Celts slash Galatians had with the
starting around
Mithridatic kingdom.
300 BC, there were population movements, and we always have to be careful about this. The idea of being overrun by barbarians, which does happen. We don't know too much about the size and so on, but these Celts had been drifting east for some time, probably because of pressures in their homeland that we don't know much about, pressures in West Central Europe. And they were in the Greek peninsula for a while. They tried to attack the great sanctuary at Delphi because they thought there was a lot of gold and silver there, and that didn't work. And eventually they continued on east and caused a certain amount of disruption, but eventually settled in a area right kind of in the middle of Asia Minor, south of Pontus. And the sources we have to be a little careful of because it's very much the idea of civilization versus the barbarians. And we have not only some good accounts, essentially contemporary accounts, but a certain amount of art was created. The dying Gaul that's in the Capitoline Museum in Rome now, created out of Pergamon. But the ability of Mithridates and Ariobarzanes to handle the Celts, who we should really call Galatians now because that's the Greek word based on the word Gaul, handle them and find them a territory essentially around modern Ankara in north central Turkey. That again was part of the rise to power of the early Pontic dynasty. They could say we were threatened by the barbarians and we took care of the problem. Though there's a little bit of creating a problem so you can solve it here. But nevertheless, it increased the prestige of the Pontic kingdom. And so the Celts were put in what we call Galatia. It's still an area of relatively low population in north central Turkey and became gradually assimilated into the multicultural uh, fabric of northern Asia Minor.
So after the death of the founder, Mithridates I, his son Ariobarzanes comes to the throne. Um, he has a relatively uneventful reign. It's about a decade, right? And
Yeah.
then all these, with the rise of his son Mithridates II, this is when things get ramped up, and we start to see these things you were talking about: royal intermarriages, legitimacy of kingship, philanthropy to areas in need like Rhodes, right? So tell us about this period of time when Pontus's profile raises significantly. This is the 240s BCE.
Yeah, during much of the 3rd century BC, Pontus gradually becomes an important state. It's not going to become something on the order of the Ptolemies or the Seleucids, but it becomes, we could even say, an important second level state. They establish a capital at Sinope on the Black Sea, which removes the kingdom from being landlocked and gives it access to the trade and commerce of the rest of the world. There are complex intermarriages, so complex it's almost hard to work through them, which connect the Pontic dynasty with the Seleucids especially, and ensure their later survival. Actually, the connection with the Seleucids means that way down the line, Cleopatra, the famous Cleopatra, actually had Pontic ancestry, among many other things. And so by the latter part of the 2nd century, or 3rd century BC, Pontus has come to rule practically most of northern Asia Minor and is an important place with marriage connections throughout the Hellenistic world.
Yeah, one thing I found especially interesting that raised their profile was the earthquake that struck Rhodes in about, I guess, 227, I believe, BCE. Um, and this is important because this destroyed one of the wonders of the Seven World, right? The Colossus of Rhodes. So I thought that that's a very interesting intersection with the history that the Mithridatic dynasty
We
had.
have
So
this list of all the kings and one queen who kicked in for restoration. And obviously, you've got the Ptolemies, you've got the Seleucids, and so forth and so on. But what's important is that the Pontic dynasty is on the list. And so it is now considered in the global scope of things one of the movers and shakers of the Hellenistic world.
right, because you look at this list and I believe it's Polybius who's giving this list, right?
Yeah.
And he's talking about how the Ptolemies gave this insane amount of
Yeah.
aid to the area, and then Pontus is kind of like one of the smaller kingdoms, but like you're right,
There's
it's
two or
like
three kingdoms we've never heard of on the list, which again
right.
shows the diversity of these little petty states. But obviously, Pontus has moved up to a higher level by this time.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's almost like a small band charting on the charts for
Yeah,
the first.
yeah, yeah,
Like, oh, they debuted at number 198 or whatever. So
yeah.
they're definitely moving up. So the rules of the game changed significantly with the arrival in Asia Minor in the late 3rd century of the Romans. Interestingly, this intervention in Eastern affairs was precipitated by their obsession with the infamous Hannibal of Carthage. So tell us about Hannibal in Asia Minor for a
Well, we
bit.
tend to forget about Hannibal when he left Italy. His period in Italy is, of course, one of the great moments of ancient history, but he was recalled by the Carthaginian assembly and in 205, I think, or right along in the last decade of the 3rd century, and brought back to Carthage. And he realized he had no future there. And so he left Carthage and headed east, still very much obsessed with the idea of putting the Romans into their place. And one thing we always have to remember about the Hellenistic period is that the Romans were the upstarts. The Romans had come from nowhere, and nobody expected the Romans to end up in the position of power that they did. As I've said before, one of the whole problems in history is that we know how things turned out. And we know the Romans are going to be on top. But nobody in 205 BC saw the Romans as anything of great importance. So Hannibal leaves Carthage and he goes goes to Asia Minor, and he spends the next 20 years circulating between the eastern courts who don't want to have anything to do with him. They know he's a hot potato. And this, among other things, brings the Romans into a political interest in Asia Minor. every time a Roman commission comes to a Eastern court, they say, we have a number of things we'd like you to do, and number one is give us Hannibal. And eventually Hannibal kind of retreats to an estate and commits suicide, but that's not for 20 years. It's not until the 180s BC. But that is a very important part in the dynamics and balance of power in the beginning of the 2nd century BC.
Yeah, this period of time is very fascinating for me in terms of Hannibal's life. He's kind of like in exile. Well, he very much is in exile. He's like this. I think we were talking backstage, and I compared him to. He's like the Julian Assange of
Yeah.
the period. Like he's like somebody that Rome really wants back, and
Mm-hmm.
he's just kind of going around creating agitation in the dynasties of
He
the Asia
did
Minor.
offer military advice, especially to Antiochus III. I mean, the Hannibal, whatever you think of him, was a superb military tactician. And so there's a kind of contradiction here. He's probably good to have on your senior military staff, but he's bad to have because of the Romans.
Right, creating so much unwanted attention, and
Yeah.
this is one of the things that kind of sparks curiosity in my mind about would the Romans have been so interested in the affairs of Asia Minor
Mm-hmm.
had Hannibal not fled there? Would they nearly care as much? And would this
Well, they might
did this technically, strangely enough, lead to their ascension in the
have
East?
been because Antiochus III invaded Europe, and
Right. Well, there's that.
was a no-no. But I think you're very right about Hannibal pushed the Romans into looking east earlier and maybe more aggressively than they would have.
So most histories of this period of time, or this dynasty, focus on Mithridates VI. He was a very colorful ruler. He exploited propaganda of omens and prophecy, and like many rulers in Asia Minor, took self-mythologizing to a whole other level of ostension. In that sense, he's not unlike Cleopatra VII. So tell us about the circumstances that led to Mithridates coming to the throne.
Well, Mithridates comes to the throne after his father, Mithridates V, dies perhaps under slightly mysterious circumstances in the 130s BC. And as is often the case, we can see the same thing with the Emperor Augustus. His success was in part due to longevity, and he rules Pontis for the next essentially 70 years. He's obviously a youngster when he comes to the throne, and he expands and consolidates the kingdom and spreads it all around the Black Sea and the entire area right up into what's today the Crimea, and along the west coast where there are Greek cities, along the east coast, which is relatively uncivilized, as well as Pontus itself. But again, in the long run, he gets tangled with the Romans. And again, I must reemphasize what I said previously, and that is that no one really took the Romans terribly seriously at this time. And especially in Pontus proper and in the western part of Pontus, well, he sets out that he's going to liberate the cities of Asia Minor from the Romans. And that initiates a series of wars with the Romans, which, because the Romans are being underestimated, gradually push Mithridates VI down. And in the long run, he has to retreat way up into the north end of the Black Sea and into the Crimea, and eventually commit suicide in 63. But we mustn't lose sight of the fact that he was a very dynamic personality. He very much so was an educated man. It said he spoke 22 languages. He was a scientific gardener. He did a lot about plant cultivation and so on, and some of the plants that he cultivated, developed, are still known today. He was able to bring culture and civilization to areas that previously didn't have it. But like Cleopatra, a generation or two later, and in one sense like Hannibal earlier, he severely underestimated the power of the Romans, and that is eventually what did him in. But he became a major cultural figure in the process.
So we've been discussing a lot about the dynasty itself, but I wanted to talk more about the um, economic aspects of this kingdom. What made it so desirable to hold on to? Because what we're leaving out that the book that you explore in the book very well is that the Mithridatic kings are constantly expanding their territory, and this isn't just one monolithic area. Like you said, this is a lot of different little um, greater and lesser kingdoms that are kind of carved out, and everybody's always got their eye on something because they want access to this trade route or they want access to these materials. So tell us about what kind of economy, what kind of trade they were popular for in production. It's all extremely important
Yeah,
to
it's
the
a very
story.
rich area. And it's, even today, northern Turkey is far lusher than the Greek peninsula. And there were many agricultural products that they could produce, mineral resources that they could produce. And through trade and commerce, and especially when they expanded up into the northern Black Sea, they had a vast amount of economic resources that made the kingdom profitable. They also had certain technological developments that helped with agriculture. I've already mentioned elements in scientific gardening, which eventually were carried to Rome and the great Roman gardens of the great Roman aristocrats really go back to the Mithridatic kingdom. There are a lot of water resources in Pontus, again, something lacking in Greece, and hydraulic developments took place that again spread to the rest of the world. So the Pontic kingdom, especially under Mithridates VI, became a very profitable area. And again, if we think of what ifs, if Mithridates hadn't embarked on this misbegotten idea that he was going to throw the Romans out of Asia Minor, things might have continued relatively differently, and he might have continued until a later date. And of course, when things settled down, the Pontic kingdom became somewhat reconstituted and lasted somewhat reduced for hundreds of years. As a matter of fact, if you take the Pontic dynasty from Mithridates I to the successors of Mithridates VI, it's the longest lasting of any of the Hellenistic dynasties, but it goes through a major reorganization when the Romans take over.
And another aspect of this expansion, of course, is that Mithridates needs manpower, right? He needs people for his armies to fight the Romans. He needs the timber from Colchis to build his ships, things like that. So it's all extremely part of the plan for him. And what I wanted to talk about a bit was how Mithridates kind of exploited the propaganda of omens and prophecy to his benefit, to make him seem like he's the guy who's going to take the Romans out. So I don't know if you could discuss this for a bit.
Yeah, we again come back to this fact that nobody was taking the Romans too seriously. But he saw himself as the new Hannibal, and he was going to succeed where Hannibal had failed. And in fact, in his last months, when he's in exile up in what we would call the Crimea, in Pantacapayan, he's drawing up plans for repeating Hannibal and invading Italy from the north. And of course, his staff is horrified at the thought because they know it's a no-brainer. But still, because of these attitudes toward the Romans, he's going to be the new Hannibal. He's going to succeed where Hannibal had failed. And if things had been a little bit different, that might have been possible. But the Romans, of course, were just beginning to move into their position of real power. This is the 60s BC. This is the period when in Rome, people like Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great are emerging as people of power. So Hannibal's not going to win on this, or not Hannibal, Mithridates is not going to win on this one. But that's not an unreasonable point of view in the 60s BC, that the Romans can be constrained, that things would go back to having the Romans limited to Italy and maybe the Greek peninsula, and that Pontus would become the great power in Asia Minor. But of course, it all falls through. But then 30 years later, Cleopatra's thinking the same thing. And again, remembering that we don't know, or they did not know, how things would play out, Cleopatra, with good reason, believes she can do now what Mithridates didn't do, and there's some evidence that she has some of Mithridates' people at her court. So it continues until finally, with the defeat of Cleopatra in 30 BC, that's probably the end of it. People are giving up wiping the Romans from the map.
Yeah, one thing I find really interesting about this anti-Roman propaganda that's happening in Asia Minor at the time, and this is something we tend to forget. We tend to focus when we think about anti-Roman imperial propaganda. We tend to think of things like Judeo-Christian sources, things like that. But we tend to forget that there's a lot of rich anti-imperial propaganda in the East as well. I'm thinking famously of the story of Bouplagos, the dead man who comes back to life to prophecy against the Romans. This is found famously in Phlegon of Tralles' Book of
Yeah,
Marvels, right?
there's a lot of anti-Roman stuff
Yeah.
circulating around. And of course, one of the things of Jesus of Nazareth was that many people thought he was going to be the guy to throw the Romans out, which is a total misinterpretation of what he was interested in. There's some evidence that Cleopatra, the prophecies that she was going to be the one, and so on. It's all over the place at this time. And again, it is a world that looks at the Romans very differently from what we do from 2,000 years later.
So tell us about Tigranes, I believe, is that how you say his name? Tigranes
Yeah.
II of Armenia. Tell us about his importance in the story of Mithridates VI and the escalation of tensions during this period of time.
Well, the Armenians were another one of these lesser states of the period. And again, the story is parallel in a sense, although the Armenians are a little more remote. Armenia, if you think of where Armenia is, it's not as connected to the Mediterranean world as Pontus was. But Mithridates certainly realized that an alliance with Armenia would be helpful, and so he has a marriage alliance with King Tigranes, And Tigranes, again, is one of these great empire builders. He goes all the way to the Mediterranean and is an important figure in the eventual collapse of the Seleucid dynasty in the early part of the 1st century BC. It's a very parallel story. Tigranes, even though he had some tangling with the Romans, it was less direct. And Tigranes' problem is that in many ways he simply overreached. And he builds his great capital, Tigranokerta, on the upper Euphrates. He never finishes it. The Romans simply move in, and the Armenian kingdom becomes a Roman province. But it's a very similar story, but one thing that we maybe pay less attention to, because he didn't directly threaten the West. He was involved in the dissolution of the Seleucid Empire, but they were already on the skids anyway. But it's again very typical of what was happening in the last century BC.
So tell us about the end of these wars with the Romans. Tell us about some of the major players on the Roman side. We've been talking a lot about Mithridates himself, but there are a lot of very important Roman figures involved in this
Yes, the Romans began
conflict.
to produce some very important figures in the 1st century BC. Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar are certainly the most notable. Of a younger generation, Mark Antony, who got into personal difficulties and never fulfilled his potential. But again, it's kind of like the Romans are finally getting their act together. And by this time, they have superior military ability. It's been said the Romans are never defeated twice, because after you defeat the Romans once, they adopt your tactics and turn around and defeat you. And that's very true in a way. And so the Romans were beginning to be realized as the wave of the future by the 1st century BC. Unfortunately, Roman history gets tangled up in its own civil war, and the 30 or 40 years from Pompey the Great, who Julius Caesar, and then Cleopatra and Antony, none of whom died naturally, show that Rome has a serious problem of instability, which is a whole nother story. But eventually, with the death of Antony and Cleopatra and the emergence of Octavian to become Augustus, things settled down. And as I said at the beginning, one of the things that allowed both Mithridates and Octavian to get as far as they did, or Augustus, is longevity. Augustus lives until he's 76 and manages essentially to create a stable Roman state. But his predecessors, Pompey and Caesar and Antony and other people, Brutus and the like, were moving Rome finally to a stable power. And by the time of Augustus, there's relatively little expansionism in the Roman Empire. There are some additions, Mauritania and Northwest Asia Minor, but at the same time, the territorial limits of Rome are fairly stable, and that allows Rome, which now extends from the Atlantic to interior Asia Minor, to finally become the new power of the era.
So, in the midst of all these Mithridatic wars, tell us about what the life of somebody who's in the royal court of Mithridates VI would have been like. What is the day to day?
Yeah, the royal court probably was more Persian than anything else. There was no great history of elaborate royal courts in the Greco-Roman world, none at all in Rome. They'd gotten rid of their kings, and the idea of a monarchy was anathema to them, although with Augustus things changed. The royal courts of Alexander and his successors were also probably modeled on the Persian courts. And there would be a very hierarchical system with the king, or in some cases the queen, in charge, and then a substratum of royal advisors who were close to the king, making policy essentially, like in any kind of system. It's the bureaucrats who are running things, not so much the leaders, but still very much Persian, but with this Greek overlay, in that people may have been bilingual, but people functioned in Greek. Mithridates probably, whatever memoirs he wrote, and we know he wrote some treatises on botany, assuredly wrote in Greek, because that gives you wider circulation. Nobody in the Greek peninsula could read Persian, but people could. Greek was everybody's second language if it was not your native language. So it was a very hierarchical monarchy, and this eventually gets transmitted to the Roman Empire, like it or not, despite the Romans' disdain of monarchy. Augustus is really little different from a Hellenistic monarch, even though he would be very insulted if you told him that. And it creates the new hierarchical system of the Roman Empire rather than the more equal system of the Roman Republic.
Mithridates, in his collection of all these different concepts and putting them all together and as the ideal Hellenistic ruler, he really reminded me of this concept that we find in folklore studies, which is the concept of ostension. I'm not sure if the audience is familiar with this term, but ostension is essentially the transmission of a legend by performing it rather than communicating it through words. So this is something that, of course, you would find in a lot of Hellenistic rulers of this period of time, assimilating themselves to something akin to an Alexander the Great returned, or you see this a lot in the Hebrew prophets, especially in the Levant during this period of time, that we're actually talking about now, because they would always model themselves after the prophets of old, and it's kind of like an acting out, almost like a cosplay in a sense. And I find that that's really interesting, and how Mithridates presented himself, because it's really it really is an acting out of the stories that everybody kind of knows. Everybody kind of knows who Alexander the Great is. Everybody knows what's expected of in these different kinds of concepts, and he's kind of bringing them all together in a very conscious way that is not unlike, of course, Cleopatra the Seventh, right?
Well, the role model was always Alexander. All of these people saw themselves as the new Alexander, whether it's Pompey the Great, who has to go all the way down to the head of the Red Sea to say he too has been on the external ocean, or there's a lot of that with Antony and Cleopatra, with creating their new world, naming their children the sun and the moon and things like that, and certainly Mithridates. And all saw that they could succeed where Alexander had failed, because Alexander's life was so short, and they would carry on the tradition, and even Augustus himself carrying on this particular tradition. And Mithridates, like Cleopatra, ended up with an extensive afterlife. I've already mentioned how he was a scientific gardener and botanist, and that some of the species he identified are still known today. But in literature and art, I mean, there's Mozart's early opera, Mithridates di Ponto, and all kinds of visual artistic presentations of Mithridates. So, like Alexander and like Cleopatra, he is still with us in essentially modern times with this very rich and thorough afterlife.
You know, somebody who you just mentioned there, that we haven't talked enough about, but who's extremely important to the ending of Mithridates' story is Pompey.
Yeah.
Of course, we have the Lex Manilia. There's a lot of machinations that I hope the viewer will go back and read the book, because it's a very complicated web of intrigues and starts and stops in this war. But ultimately, in 66 BCE, we have this thing called the Lex Manilia. And what I was just hoping you could kind of talk briefly about the importance and power this gives to Pompey in this story.
There are two things about the Lex Manilia. One is the Romans historically were very much committed to not giving people too much power, and their magistracies rotated every year, which was fine if you were a central Italian city-state. But when you ruled an empire on 3 continents, you'd send somebody out to Spain to deal with the barbarians, and it would be time to come home before he had any idea what he was doing, and then somebody else has to go out. And this was a real problem. And so we see in one of the transitions from the Roman Republic to the Empire, Romans holding power longer and longer. One of the things that did Julius Caesar in was that he became dictator for life, which is a contradiction, because a dictator is a short-term magistrate to settle a specific problem. And one of the early elements in this transition is Pompey being given this Lex Manilia, which basically said, go to the east, do anything you have to do for as long as you want to do it, basically in the context of the collapsing Seleucid Empire. But Pompey took that as an open-ended commission. He used it to get rid of Mithridates VI. He used it to eliminate the Seleucids. He was all over the east, all the way from the upper parts of the Black Sea, the Caucasus, to, as I said, the Red Sea. And eventually, of course, he too met his end because of involvement with the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt just before the death of Julius Caesar. But part of the transition from republic to empire was a realization you cannot run a major state if you're going to change the people in charge every year.
What I love about this story is that, just like our talk about Cleopatra and her afterlife, not only in terms of through literature and the cultural memory, but also literally with their descendants, the story doesn't end with Mithridates VI. So tell us about the afterlife of his ancestors and the kingdom, so to speak, because I know Mark Antony did try to briefly restart this Mithridatic
Yeah,
dynasty.
Antony and Cleopatra tried to, as you say, restart the kingdom, and there were descendants of Mithridates running around. His son Pharnabazos kind of was put on the throne after him, but overstepped and was eliminated, and things were dormant for a while. But then a reconstituted Pontic kingdom and reduced in area, limited mostly to the places north of the Black Sea, that is the Crimea and surrounding areas, was placed in position by the Romans in the 1st century AD. And it survived. It's far enough away from the heartland that it didn't cause much trouble. Pontus proper, northern Asia Minor, was stripped away and became a variety of Roman provinces. But the new reconstituted kingdom of Pontus, north of the Black Sea, continued relatively peaceably as a bulwark against the northern barbarians, at least that's the way the Romans saw it, and lasted until late antiquity. So as I said earlier, if you go from Mithridates I to late antiquity, you've got nearly 1,000 years of continuity, with a slight adjustment with Antony and Augustus, and that's the longest that any dynasty has lasted in classical antiquity.
Yeah, it's really a fantastic story, and I want to emphasize for our audience that although we're just talking about the kingdom itself of the Mithridatic Empire, the area of Pontus and Bithynia are still extremely important from this period of time on. It becomes an area where, of course, Pliny the Younger tells us that's where we first encounter Christians, right? In terms of his magistrate there, it becomes an important cultural center for a lot of orators and thinkers in the second sophistic. It doesn't just stop with Mithridates the Sixth. It continues to hold an importance in some sense or another. And even if you're a fan of early Christian history, this is where uh, the early church leader Marcion was from, who is extremely important to the
The
Christian.
Greek peninsula becomes less important. If you look at the sources like Pausanias, he's always saying, this town's abandoned, nobody lives here. But the heartland of the empire tends to be Asia Minor. As you say, some of the early Christian churches were established there. Another important person who's well known to many people was Catullus, who had a provincial position in northern Asia Minor. So that's kind of where it was all at from the first century BC.
Right. Yeah. So I just like to emphasize our story reaches its end in 63 BC, but it doesn't really. It keeps going. So Dr. Roller, I know we've touched upon a lot of ground in a very short period of time, but if there's anything you feel we missed that you'd like to emphasize, feel free to use this time.
No, I think we've covered a lot, and I think your final point is a good one. We tend to compartmentalize as historians this period, that period, whatever period, but it's a continuity, and things change, they don't start and stop. And probably to the average person living in a town in Asia Minor, well, this year it's the Romans, last year it was Pontus, and so on, but there's a continuity to life in most cases. And I think that's important to understand.
So last time we talked, I know you were working on the Pausanias translations and everything. So is that still going pretty well? Anything you want to plug, you can use this time
In
as
need
well.
of touching
So,
up, but I'm working on the notes now, essentially. And
excellent,
Oxford wants it
excellent.
by the end of summer. I may not make that, but it'll probably be finished within the year sometime.
Well, Duane Roller, this has been wonderful as always to talk to you. We always appreciate and love when you drop by to
My
talk
pleasure.
about all this really cool stuff. So yeah, thank you again, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.